Welcome to a Western Standard special. I'm Cory Morgan, columnist with the Western Standard, and I'm joined today by Franco Terrazzano, who is the Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, who's been holding our municipal and provincial government's feet to the fire, trying to keep some spending sanity going on at the very least, and exposing a lot of what's been going on. So, as always, especially in this crazy year, it's been an interesting week in the news. Finance Minister Toews perhaps has committed some blasphemy, I guess you could say, in Alberta by floating the possibility of a provincial sales tax. Can you expand on that? That's right in your turf, Franco. And again, thank you, by the way, for coming on, of course.
Well, thanks, Cory, for having me. It's always really a pleasure. Well, you know what? The United Conservatives and our Finance Minister, Travis Toews, I mean, they really need to remember the mandate that Albertans gave them, right? Albertans gave them a mandate to go to Edmonton, to cut government fat, and to lower taxes. Albertans certainly didn't boot the NDP from office so that United Conservatives could then have their turn reaching deeper into our pockets. So, I mean, it's really disappointing to be hearing Premier Jason Kenney's finance minister flirting with the idea of potentially bringing in a provincial sales tax once the pandemic settles. And really, I don't know what the finance minister is thinking. I don't know how he can think that Albertans will have enough cash left on our money tree to pay for a provincial sales tax after 5+ years of economic hardships. That includes many job losses, many pay cuts in the private sector, but also includes 2 oil price collapses and also at least 1 economic shutdown. So I don't know how the finance minister can think that struggling Albertans will have enough money to pay a provincial sales tax to fund a bloated provincial government. And on top of that, we need to know that a provincial sales tax will be costly. If we're even just thinking about a 5% PST, I mean, that could be more than $1,000 per Albertan per year.
Oh, it's a direct hit on the cost of living. Albertans are struggling already. It's interesting. We always see, economists and others float how great sales taxes are, consumption taxes are, and perhaps there's room for that discussion. But what we're hearing more is, no, this will just be another tax in addition to all the taxes we're already paying. The administration, I imagine, you guys have looked into that with the federal sales tax and harmonized sales tax. Like, as a small business owner in the past, that's another expense as well with bookkeeping and dealing, because it turns all your businesses into automatic tax collectors as well, right?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that we're most concerned about is just the fact that why are we paying higher taxes when we're looking at a massive spending problem here, right? It can't just be struggling taxpayers outside of government that are doing all the heavy lifting. So far, we really haven't seen government share in the burden of the downturn, and not just with COVID-19, but really the last 5 years. If you look at the spending comparisons and you look at Alberta, well, we would be spending $10 billion less, our provincial government, if its spending was in line per person with other large provinces like British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec. We have a $10 billion spending problem. And when you look at the budget, even before COVID-19 ever touched down in Alberta, the UCP spending was higher than the New Democrat spending. The UCP was spending more money than the NDP. So I don't know how the finance minister, Travis Toews, how he can credibly start thinking about raising taxes, even if it's just a hypothetical, before he's even cut a single penny from the province's bloated budget.
Yeah, we'd want to see, some other efforts, hopefully, rather than just dipping deeper into our pockets. So not every member of the UCP caucus seems to be walking in lockstep on this, though. It sounds like Drew Barnes has expressed some concerns. He's certainly he's the voice of the Conservative opposition in there almost. What do you think of what Drew's been saying?
Well, I think it's great to see a UCP MLA, Drew Barnes, speaking out against a sales tax. He was actually quite unequivocally against a provincial sales tax and sticking up for taxpayers. And honestly, I think we need to see more United Conservative MLA speak out against tax hikes and speak out, or I should say speak up for Alberta taxpayers. And again, it really comes down to the UCP need to remember the mandate that Albertans gave them, right? And I think if we would ask most Albertans what the UCP mandated is, I think it would boil down to 3 important things. Push back against damaging federal policies, try to get the economy going again, and sticking up for taxpayers. Well, a sales tax or any other type of tax increase doesn't fall within any of those important principles here. And what also is very frustrating is that we don't even hear the NDP pushing the UCP to be considering a sales tax. I mean, the NDP had their time in power for 4 years and they never brought in a sales tax. And also, interestingly, Rachel Notley, after hearing Travis Taves, the finance minister's recent comments about a sales tax, took quickly to Twitter to raise red flags about it. And Cory, I mean, I couldn't imagine many more thornier issues than a sales tax, which would push Albertans to be looking for a new party, than if the UCP government were to implement a sales tax. But on that note, Cory, there's one thing that I do think is important to mention, is that Premier Jason Kenney has confirmed that he will abide by the Taxpayer Protection Act. So if the government were to bring in a provincial sales tax, it would first have to go to the people through a referendum. And I just do not think that struggling Albertans will be able to or even want to pay more taxes to keep funding a bloated provincial government.
No, I guess if it would go to it, the best opportunity the government would have would be next year. It looks like they're going to be a referendum on equalization. You could couple in a couple other questions, but boy, what a political thing to take on. I mean, a bombshell. Albertans have strongly expressed that they got no use for a provincial sales tax, yet they just keep diving into that. So it'll be interesting. But again, it's up to the provincial government to take away those regulations. I mean, we used to have balanced budget legislation once too. So at best, those are just things on principle. So, I mean, in the parliamentary system, though, it does work best if, theoretically, it should be individual members speaking for their constituents. I'm glad Mr. Barnes is doing so. It would be nice if some others spoke up and we could have a broader representation. So on the bigger picture, we've got a fiscal update coming along to tell us how we're sitting going into this year. What are you anticipating there?
Well, that's correct, Cory. We are expecting another budget update by the end of this month. And certainly we're expecting it to be more bad news. We saw the last budget update in August that brought us some very bad news on the fiscal side, which I think was expected. But I mean, we heard in August that we're going to have a $24 billion deficit, which is the largest deficit in the province's history. And we're steamrolling towards $100 billion in debt by the end of the fiscal year. So we're expecting more bad news from the budget update that we're going to be seeing in November. But, I think it's important to remember, everyone out there, like, of course, COVID-19, the recent economic shutdown is impacting everyone. But really the root problems of our budget situation was planted years and years ago. I mean, we have fallen so far from the days when the former Premier Ralph Klein held up his paid in full sign back in the summer of 2004, right? Because we've seen the PCs, they doubled program spending between 2004 and 2015. And then we saw the NDP come into power. They continued the spending spree. They continued to rack up debt charges. And the UCP then was put in place to fix the budget mess. But as I said, even before COVID-19 happened, the UCP was spending more than the NDP. And that's why what we're saying is there is no way that the finance minister should even be considering potential tax hikes when he hasn't even cut a single penny from our government's bloated budget.
Well, and getting further with that, then, so I mean, if it's almost like they're sounding NDP style, where they're constantly looking on the revenue side to fix their problems rather than on the spending side, which again isn't anything at all what they campaigned on. Something, I mean, we've seen a response with them just simply trying to contract out laundry and support services in the health system, and that led to wildcat strikes and the usual hysteria from the usual suspects from the unions and NDP. But something I thought it did sound a little promising. It's a small number relative to what a lot of people in the private sector have had to deal with. But there's actually discussion starting of a broad cut to the public sector salaries, which makes up a massive part of the government budget. What are your thoughts there?
Well, first, I think it's very important to note that, I mean, letting local businesses do laundry services or sell the coffee and donuts in hospitals, really that is a common sense way to find some savings. So the government does need credit on that one. You mentioned an interesting little point when you said that sometimes the UCP started to sound like the NDP on the spending side. Well, I think that is very important to remember here, because back when the NDP was in office, they announced hundreds of millions of dollars worth of corporate welfare for the petrochemical sector. And unfortunately, what we're seeing from the UCP is continuing a bad NDP corporate welfare program. And on top of that, the UCP has added another very costly petrochemical subsidy program on top of what the NDP already had in place. So really, it's the corporate welfare is one of the big issues that we're seeing from the United Conservatives. But back to your question about the labor side, it is a good thing that Premier Jason Kenney is trying to take some air out of these ballooning government labor costs. And right now, I think we're hearing, 3 to 4% salary cutbacks. It's good to see Premier Kenney pushing on the labor, but let's be honest, a 3 to 4% pay cut. If you were one of the Albertans outside of government, right, who took a 3 to 4% pay cut, you're one of the lucky ones. And now we're hearing overheated rhetoric from union bosses who are even threatening work stoppages. Well, I don't think that's going to play well with the many Albertans who are struggling, right? Because at the end of the day, we have a question. We have $100 billion worth of debt. How are we going to pay that down? And I don't think that we can go to the struggling Albertans who the families who are just struggling to make ends meet, or the small businesses who have already had to lay off their friends, who've had to hand out significant pay cuts, and ask these Albertans outside of government to pay more money because union bosses want a pay hike.
Well, some of the union bosses themselves are quite well compensated. It's quite a world going on out there. But I mean, I guess the question is the government ready for that battle? I mean, we had wildcat strikes with something as miners outsourcing, and then even talking about. So hopefully they remain stoic in pursuing this, because we do have to get it under control. I really appreciate the Taxpayers Federation speaking up, because we certainly won't hear anything from our official opposition on any of these particular issues. They just want to spend. So where could people find more information about what you guys are up to and keeping governments to account?
Well, thanks for that, Cory. And then please head over to taxpayer.com. If you want to look at all the reports and everything that we're putting out, go to taxpayer.com and then click on our newsroom tab, and I'm sure you'll find some good stuff there.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Franco. It's always informative to sit down with you, and I'm certain we'll have much more to talk about soon as our elected officials continue to reach into our pockets. So have a good day.
Hey, you too. Thanks for having me on.